Alice adjusted her shoelaces, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Running had become her daily ritual, a way to clear her mind before another long day as a home health worker. Her job wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling. Alice found purpose in helping people, even if it meant long hours and emotional days. She liked the rhythm of the run, steady, like the life she had built for herself and her outspoken preteen daughter, Tammy. Tammy was the whirlwind in Alice's otherwise structured world. At 11, she was sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and brimming with opinions. Tammy never hesitated to speak her mind, whether she was offering unsolicited advice about Alice's boring outfits or debating world issues with the fervor of someone 3 times her age. Alice marveled at her daughter's boldness, even if it sometimes left her struggling for words. Life hadn't been easy for Alice, but she was proud of how far they'd come. Tammy had grown up knowing her dad, Elijah, only through the faded photographs tucked into a shoebox at the back of Alice's closet. Divorced when Tammy was just a baby, Alice had never spoken poorly of Elijah, but she also didn't have much to say about him. Tammy occasionally asked questions, her tone more curious than hurt, and Alice answered honestly but succinctly. Tammy never pressed, seeming content with her own interpretation of the man she saw only in pictures. As Alice hit her stride on the quiet suburban street, her thoughts wandered. Running was her therapy, a time to process the chaos of life. She often imagined what the future might hold for Tammy, a young girl so full of fire, and whether Elijah would ever step back into the picture. For now, Alice focused on the sound of her sneakers hitting the pavement and the rising sun ahead. Alice slowed her run as her phone buzzed in her pocket. Stopping near a park bench, she pulled it out and saw the name of her agency flashing on the screen. Wiping a bead of sweat from her brow, she answered, her voice still catching her breath. "Hello?" "Hi, Alice," her supervisor's voice came through. "We have a special case we need you for. It's a bit outside the usual scope, but you've always been excellent with challenging clients." Alice frowned. "What kind of special case?" "There's a meeting with the family in 2 hours. It's best they explain in person. Can you make it?" Alice hesitated. She'd had plans to spend the afternoon with Tammy, but curiosity and professional duty won out. "All right, I'll be there." 2 hours later, Alice found herself seated in the spacious and lavishly decorated living room of the Hall's estate. The grandeur of the home was overwhelming. Polished marble floors, ornate chandeliers, and walls adorned with priceless artwork. Alice couldn't help but feel out of place as she adjusted her modest blouse. Sally Halls, an impeccably dressed woman in her late 50s, entered the room. Her air of authority was palpable as she extended a hand to Alice. "Thank you for coming," Sally said, her tone brisk but polite. "I'll get straight to the point. My son, Peter, was in a motorcycle accident 6 months ago. He suffered a spinal injury and has been resistant, outright defiant, really, toward his therapists. I've been told you're particularly skilled at getting through to difficult individuals." Alice opened her mouth to respond, but Sally continued. "Be prepared for a battle. Peter doesn't respond well to pity, excuses, or any form of sugarcoating. I need you to move in and be available at any time to ensure he gets the care he needs." Alice's eyes widened. "Mrs. Halls, I appreciate your confidence in me, but moving in isn't an option. I have a daughter who needs me at home." Sally's brows furrowed in annoyance. "I'll compensate you generously. Money won't be an issue." "It's not about money," Alice replied firmly, her voice steady. "Tammy is my priority. I can't commit to something that takes me away from her, even for a case like this. I'm sorry, but I'll have to decline." Sally's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she nodded curtly. "I see. Thank you for your time, Miss James." As Alice left the mansion, she felt a twinge of guilt but stood by her decision. Tammy needed her more than anyone else, and no amount of money could change that. It had been a few days since Alice declined Sally Hall's proposition. Life had continued as usual. Morning runs, long work hours, and navigating Tammy's ever-growing schedule of activities. Tammy had just finished her homework at the dining room table when Alice's phone rang. Seeing Mrs. Hall's name on the screen, Alice sighed but answered out of courtesy. "Hello, Mrs. Halls," Alice greeted politely. "Miss James," Sally began, her tone noticeably softer this time. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but but I find myself in a bit of a bind. I've interviewed several candidates since we last spoke, but none have your particular experience and determination. My son Peter needs someone like you. It's not just about providing care, it's about understanding him, pushing him in the right way, and I believe you're the only one who can do that." Alice hesitated. "Mrs. Halls, I was very clear about my situation. My daughter—" "That's precisely why I'm calling," Sally interrupted. "I understand your reluctance. As a mother myself, I respect your priorities. So I'd like to propose a new arrangement. I'll ensure that both you and Tammy can move into our home temporarily, with all accommodations made for your daughter." Alice frowned, her curiosity piqued. "Accommodations?" "Tammy's daily needs will be fully managed," Sally explained. "I'll arrange for her transportation to and from school, any after-school activities she participates in, and even a private tutor if necessary. She'll have a dedicated space in the house where she can study, play, and feel at home. And of course, you'll be free to spend as much time with her as needed. I want to make this work, for Peter and for you." Alice's heart raced. The offer was tempting, but the idea of uprooting Tammy from their familiar life was daunting. "That's a lot to promise, Mrs. Halls. I mean every word," Sally said firmly. "I've seen what happens when Peter is left to his own devices. He's given up on himself, and I can't stand by and let that happen. You have the skills to bring him back to life, Alice, and I'll ensure Tammy's life isn't disrupted in the process." Alice glanced at Tammy, who was now sprawled on the couch, engrossed in a book. She imagined the whirlwind this change could bring and the challenges it might pose. But she also thought about Peter, a young man refusing help, possibly slipping further into despair. Alice knew what it felt like to be stuck, to feel like the world had given up on you. She could make a difference, just as she had for so many others in her care. "Can I think about it?" Alice asked finally. "Of course," Sally replied. "Take all the time you need, but please don't take too long. My son needs you." After hanging up, Alice joined Tammy on the couch, her mind swirling. "Hey, Tam," she began, her tone careful. "How would you feel about living in a big, fancy house for a while?" Tammy looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Fancy like rich people fancy? What's the catch?" Alice smiled wryly. "I'd have to work there, helping someone who really needs it, but they'd make sure you're taken care of too. School, activities, everything." Tammy considered this, then shrugged. "I mean, as long as I still get to do my stuff, I'm cool with it. Plus, I've always wanted to see how rich people live." Alice chuckled, her daughter's candor breaking the tension in her chest. "All right, I'll talk to them again and see how this could work." Later that evening, Alice called Mrs. Halls back. "I'll do it," she said, "but I need to see every detail of this arrangement in writing before we move forward." "Of course," Sally replied, relief evident in her voice. "I'll have everything prepared by tomorrow. Thank you, Miss James. You're doing the right thing." As Alice hung up, she felt a mix of apprehension and determination. It wouldn't be easy, but it might just be the opportunity to change a life, maybe even two. The first day at the Halls estate was a whirlwind. After settling into their new quarters, Alice and Tammy were given a tour of the sprawling mansion. Tammy's room was straight out of a magazine, with plush bedding, a study nook, and a view of the impeccably landscaped garden. Alice's room was equally luxurious, but she felt a sense of unease. It wasn't the surroundings, it was the weight of the task ahead. After showing them their rooms, Mrs. Halls led them to Peter's wing of the house. It was quieter here, almost eerily so. When they entered his room, Peter was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the grounds. He didn't look up when they entered. "Peter," Mrs. Halls said, her tone gentle but firm. "This is Miss James. She'll be helping you from now on." Peter didn't respond. His face was impassive, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And this is her daughter, Tammy," Sally added, trying to inject warmth into the introduction. "Hi," Tammy said brightly, waving. Peter didn't so much as glance at them. Alice wasn't surprised. She'd worked with resistant clients before. She nodded to Mrs. Halls, signaling they could leave, and the two women exited the room, leaving Alice and Tammy standing awkwardly. "Guess he's not big on first impressions," Tammy whispered. Alice managed a small smile. "Give him time." The next morning, Alice began her day the way she always did, with a run. She wound through the estate grounds, enjoying the early morning calm. By the time she returned, she felt centered and ready for the challenge ahead. Peter's physical therapist arrived shortly after breakfast. Alice observed as they went through the motions. Peter barely cooperated, his responses clipped and his movements lethargic. Once the therapist left, Alice pulled a chair beside him. "Hi, Peter," she began softly. "I thought maybe we could talk." He didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze returned to the window, his silence impenetrable. Alice sighed, but didn't give up. She told him a little about herself, how she'd become a home health worker, why she enjoyed helping people, and even how she started running as a way to clear her mind. Peter didn't react, but Alice kept at it. For days, this became their routine. Alice would spend hours talking to Peter, filling the silence with stories about her life and funny anecdotes about Tammy. Sometimes she brought a book and read aloud. Other times she simply sat beside him, her words steady and calm. But Peter never spoke. Not a single word. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alice was sitting in her room when her phone rang. The name on the screen made her stomach flip. Elijah. Her ex-husband hadn't been a part of their lives for years, and his sudden call felt like a ghost from the past. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Hi, Alice." Elijah's voice came through. It was deeper than she remembered, but unmistakable. "How've you been?" Alice was taken aback. "Elijah, why are you calling?" I've been thinking about Tammy," he admitted. "I know I haven't been around, but I'd like to see her, talk to her if she's open to it." Alice's heart clenched. Tammy had grown up knowing her father only through photos and the occasional story. Elijah's absence had left a void that Alice had worked hard to fill. She wasn't sure how Tammy would react to this sudden interest. "I don't know," Alice said honestly. "This is a lot to process. I'll have to think about it." "Take your time," Elijah said. I want to do the right thing now, Alice. For her." After hanging up, Alice felt a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, and an unexpected flicker of hope. She knew she needed to sort through her feelings before bringing this up to Tammy. That afternoon, Alice sat beside Peter as usual, but this time she didn't speak. Her mind was too preoccupied with Elijah's call. She stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. After several minutes, Peter broke the silence. "What's wrong? You're not talking today." Alice's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. It took her a moment to process what had just happened. Peter had spoken. For the first time in weeks, he'd said something. "You." She stopped herself, not wanting to overwhelm him. "You noticed?" Peter turned his head slightly, his expression still guarded. "It's hard not to. You never stop talking." Alice chuckled softly, relief washing over her. "Fair enough. I guess I've had a lot on my mind today." Peter nodded, his gaze returning to the window. "Something about your daughter?" Alice blinked, surprised again. "How did you?" "You mentioned her. A lot." His voice was flat, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his tone. Alice hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Yeah, her dad called me today. He hasn't been in her life, and now he says he wants to see her. I don't know how to feel about it." Peter was silent for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he said, "That's hard." Alice studied him, her heart swelling with cautious optimism. "It is," she agreed, "but I'm trying to figure it out." For a long time they sat in silence, both staring out the window. Alice didn't press him to talk further, and Peter didn't offer more. But the simple fact that he'd spoken felt like a breakthrough. When Alice left his room that evening, she couldn't stop smiling. Tammy noticed and raised an eyebrow. "What's up with you?" Tammy asked. "Did the grumpy guy finally say something?" Alice grinned. "He did." Tammy smirked. "Told you he couldn't resist your endless stories." Alice laughed, ruffling her daughter's hair. "Maybe you're right." For the first time since they'd moved into the Hall's mansion, Alice felt a spark of hope. It wasn't just about Peter finding his voice. It was about Alice finding hers, too. Together, they were beginning to piece together something that resembled progress. The next morning, Alice walked into Peter's room with her usual calm demeanor. She brought her chair to its usual spot next to his and opened the book she'd been reading aloud for the past few days. "Where were we?" she asked, mostly to herself. "Ah, right here." Her voice was soothing as she read, weaving the tale with a practiced rhythm. Peter didn't say much, but his eyes were no longer glued to the window. Instead, they followed her occasionally, a flicker of curiosity showing in his otherwise stoic expression. Alice knew he was listening, even if he wouldn't admit it. Just as she reached an exciting part of the story, Alice closed the book abruptly and stood. "Wait, what? What happens next?" Peter asked, the frustration in his voice barely concealed. Alice smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, she walked out of the room without another word, leaving Peter to stare after her, baffled. He waited, certain she would return any minute to finish. But an hour passed and Alice didn't come back. Alice went straight to Mrs. Hall's study, where the older woman was sorting through paperwork. "How's he doing?" Mrs. Halls asked without looking up. Alice took a seat across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "He's making progress. He's more engaged now, and he's listening, even if he won't admit it. But he's still stuck in his anger and grief. I think I need to push him further." Mrs. Halls frowned. "Further? What does that mean?" Alice leaned forward. "Peter needs a reason to feel alive again. Right now, he's passive. He listens, but he doesn't act. He doesn't care. My plan is to make him uncomfortable enough to feel something, anything that forces him to confront what he's avoiding." Mrs. Halls raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" "You've already seen the start of it," Alice said cryptically, rising to leave. Meanwhile, Peter sat in his room, his frustration mounting. The book Alice had been reading to him sat on the table next to his wheelchair, taunting him with its incomplete story. He picked it up, flipped through the pages, and then slammed it shut. He wanted Alice to come back and finish it. After all, she always finished what she started. Unable to take it anymore, Peter called his mother. "Where's Alice?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. Mrs. Halls, surprised to hear her son's voice filled with such urgency, replied carefully, "Alice has personal business to attend to." "She just left," Peter snapped. "She didn't even finish the story." "She'll be back," Mrs. Halls said soothingly, though she couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope at her son's reaction. But Alice didn't come back for dinner, and Peter's agitation grew. By the next morning, when Alice didn't appear at breakfast either, he was visibly upset. "Where is she?" Peter demanded, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair tightly. Mrs. Halls observed her son closely. For the first time in months, he seemed fully alert, driven by an emotion other than apathy. It wasn't joy, but it was something. "She'll come when she's ready," Mrs. Halls said softly, though she was beginning to question Alice's methods. When Alice finally entered Peter's room later that afternoon, his reaction was immediate. "Where have you been?" he barked, his voice filled with anger. "You just left. No explanation, no nothing." Alice stood her ground, her arms crossed. "I don't owe you an explanation, Peter. What is that supposed to mean?" he shouted, his voice rising. "You can't just leave things unfinished." "Why not?" Alice snapped back, her voice just as loud. "You do it all the time. You've given up on everything, your therapy, your family, yourself. Why should I be any different?" Peter's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, Alice turned on her heel and walked out, slamming the door behind her. For the rest of the day, Peter didn't see her, and it ate at him. That evening, Mrs. Halls cornered Alice in the hallway. "How long are you planning to keep this up?" she demanded, her tone a mix of concern and exasperation. "As long as it takes," Alice replied firmly. Mrs. Halls crossed her arms. "Peter's getting more attached to you than I've ever seen him get to anyone since the accident. Is this really helping?" "It is," Alice assured her. "Peter needs a reason to care again, to fight for something. Right now, he's reacting emotionally, and that's exactly what I want. He's starting to feel, and that's the first step toward healing." "But why stop in the middle of the story?" Mrs. Halls pressed. "It's driving him crazy." Alice's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Exactly. I read his profile when I took this job. Peter hates leaving things undone. It's in his nature to finish what he starts. Right now, he's so fixated on the story that he's finally showings of the old him, the part that doesn't like loose ends. I'm going to use that to push him toward something bigger." Mrs. Halls shook her head, a small smile breaking through her worry. "You're devious, Miss James." "Sometimes," Alice admitted with a shrug, "but this isn't about me. It's about Peter finding a reason to fight again." That night, Alice sat in her room, quietly preparing for the next step in Peter's recovery. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to help him find his way back, one unfinished story at a time. The morning sunlight filtered into the dining room as Alice entered, her voice carrying a cheerful tune. She hummed and sang softly as she moved about, serving herself coffee and toast, acting as though the heated exchange with Peter the day before hadn't happened. Tammy was already seated, munching on cereal, and Peter was at the table, looking less than thrilled. "Good morning," Alice chirped, her tone bright and upbeat. Peter glared at her. "Will you finish your story today?" he asked bluntly, his frustration still evident. Alice poured her coffee and took a leisurely sip before responding. "Sure," she said, her eyes sparkling mischievously, "but only after you follow the therapist's instructions fully today." Peter scoffed, his expression darkening. "You can't blackmail me into doing physical therapy." Alice's lips curved into a playful smirk. "No, I can't," she admitted, "but you also can't make me finish the story." Tammy, observing the exchange, let out a giggle. "You two sound like an old married couple." Peter turned his attention to her, arching an eyebrow. "If we'd been together that long, I'd have trained Alice by now." Alice's smirk widened. "Trained me? Oh no, Peter. If we'd been together that long, I'd have trained you, to bend to my every command." Tammy burst into laughter so hard that she slid off her chair and onto the floor, clutching her stomach. Peter shook his head, a reluctant grin forming despite himself. "You're insufferable," he muttered, though his tone lacked any real venom. "And you're predictable," Alice shot back, her grin turning triumphant. Their banter was interrupted by the sound of a throat clearing. Mrs. Halls stood in the doorway, looking between them with a mixture of confusion and surprise. "What's going on in here?" she asked. Tammy, still on the floor and gasping for air between laughs, pointed at Alice and Peter. "They're hilarious. Like, seriously, it's like watching a sitcom." Mrs. Halls stepped further into the room, glancing at Peter. What she saw astonished her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, his eyes bright with amusement. She hadn't seen her son like this since before the accident. "I'm just working my magic," Alice said breezily, taking a seat across from Peter. Peter rolled his eyes, but the smile lingered. "Magic, huh? Is that what you call it?" "Absolutely," Alice replied, cutting into her toast with deliberate precision. "And if you want more of my magic, you know the terms." Peter sighed dramatically, but didn't argue further. Mrs. Halls watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of hope. For the first time in months, there was laughter in the house, genuine, infectious laughter. She caught Alice's eye and gave her a small nod of approval. Alice nodded back subtly before turning her attention back to Peter. "All right, Peter," Alice said with a teasing grin. "Finish your breakfast. You're going to need your energy for the physical therapy session today. Remember, it's the only way you're getting the ending of that story." Peter groaned but picked up his fork, and the room erupted in more laughter. Even Mrs. Halls couldn't help but chuckle as she watched her son take another small but meaningful step toward recovery. Alice stood to the side of the therapy room, arms crossed, her sharp gaze fixed on Peter as he worked through his exercises with the physical therapist. It wasn't lost on her that Peter was putting in more effort than usual today, his movements more deliberate, his responses to the therapist less resistant. "That's it, Peter," the therapist encouraged. "Keep going. You're doing great." Peter grimaced but didn't stop, pushing through each exercise. Alice couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He was finally engaging, finally trying. When the session ended, Peter slumped in his wheelchair, wiping sweat from his brow. "Satisfied?" he muttered, glancing at Alice. "Very," Alice replied, her tone light but genuine. "You earned the rest of that story." Alice kept her word, returning to Peter's room after a quick break. She resumed the story exactly where she had left off, her voice drawing him back into the narrative. For the first time, Peter seemed fully absorbed, his expression shifting with the twists and turns of the plot. By the time she finished, he was quiet, his eyes lingering on the view outside his window. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Alice smiled, patting his arm. "Anytime." Later, as they sat on the patio enjoying a simple lunch of sandwiches and salad, Alice noticed how the sunlight softened Peter's features. His usual scowl had eased, replaced with a thoughtful expression. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warm breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. The peace was interrupted by the unexpected sight of a figure approaching. Alice squinted, her heart skipping when she recognized him. Elijah. He looked older, more weathered than she remembered, but there was no mistaking him. Tammy's father, her ex-husband. Elijah stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Alice," he said, his voice steady but cautious. Alice set down her sandwich, her stomach tightening. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said, glancing briefly at Peter, who was watching the exchange with thinly veiled curiosity. "You haven't returned my calls." "I've been busy," Alice replied evenly. "You know how my work is." "I get that," Elijah said, his voice softening. "But I'm not going to stop calling until we talk. About Tammy. I want to be in her life." Alice's chest tightened further. She had spent years building a stable life for Tammy without Elijah's involvement. His sudden desire to reconnect felt like a disruption she wasn't ready for, but she could see the determination in his eyes, and a small part of her wanted to believe he was sincere. Peter's gaze darted between them, clearly piecing together what was happening. "You need me to give you two some space?" he asked, surprising Alice with his perceptiveness. "No," Alice said quickly, shaking her head. She stood, her voice firm but calm as she addressed Elijah. "Fine, we'll talk, but not here. I'll meet you for lunch tomorrow." Elijah nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Thank you, that's all I'm asking." As he turned to leave, Peter raised an eyebrow. "That was interesting." Alice sighed, sitting back down. "That's one way to put it." "You think he means it?" Peter asked, his tone surprisingly neutral. "I don't know," Alice admitted, "but I guess I'll find out." They finished their lunch in relative quiet, though Alice's thoughts were anything but calm. Tomorrow's meeting loomed large, stirring up old memories and questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Still, she reminded herself that her priority was, and always would be, Tammy. Alice entered the coffee shop, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Elijah. He was already seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his mug, but when he saw her, he straightened and offered a tentative smile. "Alice," he said as she sat down across from him. "Thanks for meeting me." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Let's get to it. What's on your mind?" Elijah took a deep breath. "I want to make amends, Alice, with you and with Tammy. I've been thinking a lot about the choices I've made, the time I've wasted. I had a health scare recently, and it hit me. Life's too short. I don't want to leave things the way they are." Alice's expression didn't soften. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "Elijah, Tammy knows you only through the photos I kept and the child support checks you sent. She's not a small child anymore. She's a teenager with her own opinions and a lot of attitude. Forgiveness won't come easy, if at all." "I understand that," Elijah said earnestly. "I'm ready for it. I'm ready for all the criticism, the anger, whatever she throws my way. I deserve it." Alice studied him, her skepticism giving way to a glimmer of cautious hope. He seemed genuine, but she had her doubts. "This isn't just about you anymore, Elijah. It's Tammy's choice. I'll talk to her about it, but I won't force her into anything." Elijah nodded, his eyes heavy with emotion. "That's all I ask. I just want a chance." Alice sighed, standing. "I'll let you know what she says, but don't expect miracles." As she left the coffee shop, her mind swirled with possibilities, unsure what Tammy's reaction would be. After dinner, Alice sat Tammy down for a heart-to-heart conversation. The tension was palpable as Alice gently explained her meeting with Elijah and his desire to reconnect with Tammy. "Why now?" Tammy asked, her voice laced with confusion and anger. "Why does he suddenly care? I've spent my whole life without him, and now he wants to show up and play dad?" Alice sighed, her heart breaking for her daughter. "I don't have all the answers, Tammy. He says he had a health scare, and it made him realize how short life can be. But this isn't about him or me. It's about you. You don't have to decide now, and you don't have to meet him if you don't want to. Just take some time to think about it." Tammy's eyes narrowed, her arms crossed defensively. "I don't know, Mom. It's weird and kind of messed up." "I understand," Alice said softly. "Take all the time you need." Later that evening, Alice sat alone in the garden, tears streaming down her face. The weight of the situation, combined with her own unresolved feelings about Elijah, was too much to bear in silence. Peter, who had wheeled himself to the edge of the garden for some fresh air, noticed her but didn't approach. He respected her space, even as he felt a pang of concern. The next morning, Alice came down to breakfast with a bright smile, acting as though nothing in her life was out of the ordinary. Tammy, trying her best to lighten the mood, cracked a few jokes, and the two laughed over scrambled eggs. But Peter, ever the observer, saw the faint shadows in Alice's eyes. As breakfast wound down, Peter turned to Tammy. "Hey, Tammy, can I ask you something?" "Sure," Tammy said, raising an eyebrow. "How do you feel about helping me get even with your mom for forcing me to do all this therapy?" Tammy's eyes lit up, her mischievous grin spreading across her face. "Oh, I'm so in! What's the plan? I heard you hate the song Oh Happy Me," Peter said, smirking. Tammy groaned dramatically. "Hate isn't a strong enough word. It's torture." "Perfect," Peter said, raising his hand for a high five. "Let's rig the sound system to play it on loop all day." Tammy burst into laughter, slapping his hand. "Genius. Let's do it." By mid-morning, the entire house was filled with the peppy, saccharine tones of Oh Happy Me. The song played relentlessly, its cheerful melody echoing through every room. Alice groaned in mock exasperation, her hands covering her ears as she came into the living room. "All right, you two, this is war. Revenge will be mine." Peter and Tammy collapsed into laughter, Tammy practically rolling off the couch as she clutched her stomach. Alice shook her head, but a genuine smile tugged at her lips. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Tammy knocked on Alice's door. "Mom," Tammy said hesitantly, stepping inside. Alice sat up, her expression softening. "What is it, sweetie?" "I've decided," Tammy said, taking a deep breath. "I want to meet him. I have questions, and I need answers." Alice nodded, pride and apprehension mixing in her heart. "Okay, I'll call him tomorrow and set it up for the weekend." Tammy hesitated, then added, "I'm scared, though." Alice reached out, pulling Tammy into a hug. "It's okay to be scared. I'll be there with you every step of the way." The following evening, Alice once again found herself in the garden. She leaned against a wooden railing, gazing at the stars and trying to steady her swirling thoughts. This time, Peter approached, wheeling himself close and breaking the silence. "How are you holding up with all this Elijah stuff?" Peter asked, his voice quiet but steady. Alice glanced at him, grateful for his concern. "It's complicated. Seeing him again stirred up a lot of old feelings, anger, hurt, confusion. But none of it matters as much as Tammy. This is about her now." Peter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds tough, but you've handled tougher, haven't you? Like, say, helping someone recover from a major accident?" Alice laughed softly, shaking her head. "Point taken. It's not easy, but I'll get through it." Just then, Tammy emerged from the house, joining them in the garden. She plopped down on the grass beside Peter's wheelchair, her face thoughtful. "I'm nervous about meeting him," Tammy admitted, picking at the blades of grass. "What if he's a jerk? What if he's great, and I feel bad for not wanting him around before?" Alice knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's okay to feel conflicted. You don't have to decide anything right away. Just go in with an open mind and see where it takes you." Peter spoke up, his voice warm. "For what it's worth for you, both of you." Tammy looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You'd come to the meeting?" Peter shrugged. "If you want me to, sure. Sometimes it helps to have an outside perspective." Alice started to protest. "No, Peter, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Peter said firmly, cutting her off. "You've done so much for me, Alice. This is the least I can do." Tammy grinned. "I'd like that. It'd be cool to have backup." Alice sighed but relented, her heart warmed by Peter's offer. "All right, but don't think this means you're getting out of therapy." Peter smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." As the three of them sat together in the cool night air, Alice felt a flicker of hope. They were an unconventional group, but in that moment they felt like a team, a family of sorts. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The weekend arrived faster than Alice expected, and the day of Tammy's meeting with Elijah was upon them. They had chosen a neutral location, a quiet park with sprawling green lawns and shaded benches. Tammy clutched Alice's hand tightly as they approached Elijah, who was already waiting near a picnic table. Peter had come along for moral support, but stayed back, observing from a distance to give them privacy. Elijah stood as they approached, his face lighting up with a mix of hope and apprehension. Tammy released Alice's hand and stopped a few feet away from him, her expression unreadable. "Hi, Tammy," Elijah said softly. "Hi," Tammy replied, her tone guarded. Alice gave her a reassuring nod and stepped back, letting them have their space. Tammy crossed her arms, tilting her head as she studied Elijah. "So, is your health better or worse now?" Elijah blinked, surprised by her directness. "Better," he said after a moment. "The scare I had was serious, but I've been taking care of myself. I still have a while before I'm fully restored, but I'm on the right path." Tammy narrowed her eyes slightly. "What happened exactly?" Elijah hesitated. "It was my heart. The doctor said I wasn't in immediate danger, but it was a warning. I needed to make changes, stress less, eat healthier, that kind of thing." Tammy nodded, processing his words. "So you got scared and decided now was the time to reach out?" Elijah winced at the bluntness of her question, but nodded. "Yes. I realized how much time I'd wasted, how much I'd missed, and I didn't want to leave things like this between us." Tammy continued her interrogation. "Why did you leave in the first place? Was it me? Did you not want to be a dad?" Elijah's face crumpled slightly. "It wasn't you, Tammy. It was never you. I wasn't ready to be the kind of father you deserved. I made mistakes, big ones. I thought stepping back was the best thing for you and your mom, but I was wrong." Tammy's lips pressed into a thin line. "Why didn't you try harder? Like, couldn't you have visited or something?" Elijah rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable, but trying his best to answer honestly. "I was ashamed. I didn't know how to fix things, so I avoided them instead. I see now that it was selfish and unfair to you." Tammy frowned, processing his words. She had a dozen more questions swirling in her mind and wasted no time firing them off. "What's your job? Do you have another family? Do you even know what I like to do?" Elijah answered as best as he could, though some of the questions left him floundering. He explained his job in construction management, assured her he didn't have another family, and admitted that he didn't know her hobbies, but wanted to learn. As the conversation went on, Elijah's discomfort was evident, but he remained patient and open. Tammy's tone softened slightly as her curiosity began to outweigh her anger. Meanwhile, Alice watched from a distance, her heart in her throat. Peter, seated beside her on a bench, offered a small smile. "She's tough, but he's holding up." "She has every right to be," Alice replied quietly. "But he's trying, and that counts for something." Peter nodded, his gaze shifting back to Tammy and Elijah. "Looks like he's willing to face the music. That's a start." After nearly an hour of intense conversation, Tammy finally sat down on the picnic table bench across from Elijah. She seemed calmer, though her expression remained cautious. "I'm not saying I forgive you," she said, her voice firm but less sharp. "But I'll give you a chance. I want to see what kind of dad you're going to be now." Elijah exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Thank you, Tammy. That means more to me than I can say." Tammy glanced over her shoulder at Alice, who gave her an encouraging smile. Then, surprising everyone, Tammy gestured for Alice and Peter to join them. As the four of them sat together, the tension slowly eased, and a glimmer of something new began to take shape. A second chance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tammy stood across from Elijah, preparing to say goodbye. She hesitated for a moment, then gave him a sly smile. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "I guess I'll see if you can be a better dad than Peter." Alice's eyes widened in shock. "Tammy!" Before Alice could say more, Peter, sitting in his wheelchair nearby, grabbed her arm. His face broke into a mischievous grin as he addressed Elijah. "Yes, Elijah, we'll see who's better, me or you. Can this man in a wheelchair outdo you as a dad? What do you say?" Elijah blinked, utterly dumbfounded. He opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to find no words. Tammy burst into laughter, her voice ringing through the park, and then turned and walked away, leaving the adults standing there in varying states of disbelief. Alice clenched her jaw, her frustration clear. "Tammy!" she called after her daughter, but Tammy only waved her off with a grin. As they walked back toward the car, Alice turned her sharp gaze to Peter. "What was that? Her life isn't a game, Peter?" Peter wheeled beside her, unbothered by her irritation. "Relax, Alice. She's testing him. She wants to see if he'll stick around or walk away." Alice shook her head, her voice stern. "That's not how you build relationships, Peter. You don't manipulate people to see how far they'll go." Peter smirked, glancing over at Tammy, who was still a few steps ahead. "She's just like you, Alice, full of tricks." Alice exhaled sharply but said nothing more until they returned to the house. After Tammy went to bed, Alice sat down with Peter in the living room. "Peter," she began, her tone serious, "I need you to stop encouraging Tammy in this kind of behavior. She's already dealing with enough without you adding to it." Peter shrugged, leaning back in his wheelchair. "What did I do? I just played along. Besides, is it so impossible to think that I could be a better father figure than Elijah?" Alice's jaw dropped, stunned by the unexpected question. "Peter, we're not even dating. How are we talking about you being a father figure, or getting married?" Peter's grin widened, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Give me time, Alice. It'll happen. You'll see." Alice crossed her arms, incredulous. "My husband will be standing at the end of the aisle at my wedding, Peter. Not sitting in a wheelchair making cheeky remarks." Peter raised an eyebrow, his grin never faltering. "Is that a challenge, Alice?" She shook her head, muttering under her breath. "I'm going to have a long talk with your mother about your behavior tomorrow." Peter chuckled, clearly unfazed. "Good luck with that. She'll probably tell you I've always been like this." Alice stood, glaring at him one last time, before heading to her room. "We'll see, Peter. Good night." As Alice walked away, Peter watched her go, his grin softening into a thoughtful smile. The banter might have been playful, but in his heart, he knew there was something more between them. Something worth waiting for. The next morning, Alice rose early, determined to have a productive day and avoid any more surprises. She had spent half the night replaying Peter's bold words in her mind, her emotions swinging between irritation and a strange, unexpected warmth. Downstairs, the house was alive with activity. Tammy was already at the table, munching on toast, while Peter rolled into the kitchen with his usual smirk, clearly ready for round 2 of their ongoing banter. Alice braced herself. "Morning, Alice," Peter said cheerfully, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Sleep well, or were you dreaming about how to win our little challenge?" Alice shot him a look. "Peter, don't start." Tammy, always attuned to the undercurrent of humor between the two, snickered. "Mom, Peter's got a point. You were pretty quiet after last night. Maybe he's getting to you." Alice leveled a stern gaze at her daughter. "Tammy, eat your breakfast. And you," she said, pointing at Peter, "I need to speak to your mother today about your attitude." "Oh, I'm sure she'll love hearing about me trying to win your heart," Peter quipped, his grin widening. Tammy nearly choked on her toast from laughing too hard. "You two are like a comedy duo," Alice groaned, deciding it was best to ignore them both for the time being. She grabbed her planner and went out to the garden to make some calls. Later that day, Alice met with Mrs. Halls in the study to discuss Peter's progress. "He's doing well," Alice admitted, her tone professional. "But he's been testing boundaries." Mrs. Halls raised an eyebrow. "Boundaries? Do tell." Alice hesitated before explaining the recent events, from Tammy's playful jab at Elijah to Peter's overly confident comments about their future. Mrs. Halls laughed softly. "Peter has always been headstrong. It's what got him through the worst of the accident. But Alice, if he's teasing you like this, it's because he sees something special in you." Alice blushed, shaking her head. "I'm here to help him recover, not entertain his ideas of romance." Mrs. Halls smiled knowingly. "Sometimes recovery isn't just physical, and Peter has a way of surprising people. Don't write him off too quickly." That evening, as Alice was watering the garden, Peter wheeled out to join her, his expression unusually serious. "Hey," he began, his tone softer than usual, "I wanted to apologize if I've been pushing too hard. I joke a lot, but I meant what I said. You've been good for me, Alice, for Tammy too. I see how much you care, and it's rare to find someone like that." Alice paused, the hose still in her hand, and turned to face him. For once, she couldn't find the words to deflect or tease. "Peter, she started but stopped, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his eyes. "Just think about it," he said, giving her a small smile. "No rush." Alice nodded slowly, her heart conflicted. She watched as Peter turned to wheel himself back toward the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night, Tammy found Alice sitting on the couch, lost in thought. She plopped down next to her mother and rested her head on her shoulder. "Mom, are you okay?" Tammy asked softly. Alice sighed, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about a lot of things," Tammy grinned. "Like Peter?" Alice looked down at her daughter, startled by her insight. "What makes you say that?" Tammy shrugged. "It's obvious. You like him, Mom, and I think he really likes you too. Maybe you should give him a chance." Alice was about to respond when Peter's voice called from the other room. "Tammy, if you're trying to play matchmaker, at least give me some warning next time." Tammy laughed, and Alice couldn't help but chuckle too. Maybe, just maybe, Peter's unshakable confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Over the next few weeks, Tammy slowly began to open up to her father, Elijah. Their time together started cautiously, with short walks in the park or chats over ice cream. Elijah patiently answered Tammy's many questions, even when they made him visibly uncomfortable. Gradually, Tammy softened, her walls lowering just enough to allow a tentative connection to grow. Alice watched from a distance, her emotions a mix of pride, relief, and lingering apprehension. Meanwhile, within the walls of the Hall's estate, life carried on with a semblance of normalcy. Alice and Peter continued their playful banter, each pretending that nothing deeper was happening between them. Despite their best efforts to keep things professional, the unspoken connection between them only seemed to deepen. Peter's physical progress was remarkable. His therapy sessions were more productive, his attitude more determined. He began to see the possibility of reclaiming aspects of his old life, or even forging a new one entirely. One afternoon, as he rested in the study, he decided to broach the topic with his mother. "Mom," Peter said, rolling his chair closer to her desk, "there's something I need to tell you." Mrs. Halls looked up from her paperwork, her sharp eyes immediately softening. "What is it, Peter?" Peter hesitated for a moment before plunging ahead. "I have feelings for Alice." Mrs. Halls smiled knowingly. "I've suspected as much, and how does she feel about you?" Peter shrugged, a touch of vulnerability slipping through his usual confidence. "I don't know. We haven't talked about it. I didn't want to make things awkward while she's here, but I've been thinking about taking my treatment to the next level. At the Wellness Institution of Southwest. It's aggressive therapy, but it could really help." "That's wonderful," Mrs. Halls said, her face lighting up. "But have you told Alice about this plan?" Peter shook his head. "I want to see how the treatment goes first. If it works, maybe I'll feel like I can offer her more." Mrs. Halls sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Peter, you need to talk to her before you leave. Alice deserves to know how you feel, and you need to know how she feels about you. You can't just disappear into therapy without clearing the air." Peter frowned, his expression conflicted. "What if she doesn't feel the same way? I don't want to ruin what we have." "Peter," his mother said firmly, "you're strong enough to handle whatever her response is. And if she does feel the same way, wouldn't it be better to go into this new chapter with her support?" Peter nodded slowly, realizing the truth in her words. "You're right. I'll talk to her before I go." Mrs. Halls reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand on his. "Good. She deserves to know, and so do you." Later that evening, as Peter wheeled himself into the garden where Alice often spent her evenings, he steeled himself for what he was about to do. The weight of his unspoken feelings had grown too heavy to bear, and it was time to lay everything on the line. One way or another, he needed to know where they stood. The garden was quiet, the evening breeze gently rustling the leaves as Alice sat on a wooden bench, staring at the stars. It was her favorite spot to unwind after a long day, a place where she could let her thoughts wander. Tonight, however, her peace was interrupted by the soft hum of wheels on gravel. She turned to see Peter rolling toward her, a determined look on his face. His usual teasing grin was absent, replaced with something more serious. Alice straightened, sensing this wasn't one of their usual banter-filled conversations. "Hey," Peter began, his voice softer than usual. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not," Alice said, gesturing to the space beside her. "What's on your mind?" Peter took a deep breath, bracing himself. "Alice, you've done so much for me, more than you probably realize. You've been my rock through all of this. Because of you, I've found the confidence to take the next step in my recovery." Alice tilted her head, her expression curious. "The next step?" "I'm going to the Wellness Institution of Southwest for aggressive therapy," Peter explained. "It's going to be intense, and there are no guarantees, but I need to try. I want to see how far I can push myself." Alice's face softened with pride. "That's incredible, Peter. I know you'll give it your all." Peter hesitated, his heart pounding. "There's something else I need to say. I have strong feelings for you, Alice. You've been so much more than my caregiver or my friend. When I come back, regardless of what the therapy achieves, I want to date you. I want to see where this could go." Alice's breath hitched, her eyes searching his face. For a moment she was silent, and Peter feared the worst. But then she smiled, her expression warm and full of promise. "I'll be waiting," she said softly. "And I'll be ready for our first dance, no matter what." Peter's heart soared, and he couldn't stop the grin that spread across his face. "That's a deal." Later that evening, Peter asked Tammy to join him in the study for a private conversation. Tammy entered with her usual sass, plopping onto the couch and crossing her arms. "What's up, Peter? You're not dying or something, are you?" she joked, though there was a hint of genuine concern in her voice. Peter chuckled. "No, nothing like that. I wanted to tell you personally. I'm leaving for therapy soon. It's going to be intense, and I'll be gone for a while, but when I come back, I want to be better. Not just physically, but better for your mom, and for you." Tammy blinked, her expression softening as she sat up straighter. "You mean that?" "Absolutely," Peter said. "I know your dad's trying to reconnect, and that's great. But if there's room in your life for another father figure, I'll do my best to be the best one." Tammy smiled, her tough exterior cracking. "My bet's on you, Peter." Peter laughed, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "Thanks, kiddo. That means a lot." The next morning, as Peter prepared to leave, he gave Alice one last smile, filled with determination. "When I come back, be ready for that dance." Alice laughed softly, her heart full. "I'll hold you to that." As Peter rolled out of the house, Tammy stood beside Alice, watching him go. "He's going to make it," Tammy said confidently. "I just know it." Alice nodded, her eyes misty. "I think so too." Together they waved goodbye, ready to embrace the next chapter of their unconventional but growing family. "Hello," she answered, her voice trembling. "Alice," came Peter's voice, warm and familiar. The moment she heard him, Alice broke down, tears streaming down her face as sobs overtook her. "Peter," she managed through her tears. "Oh, Peter, I've missed you so much." Hearing her cry, Tammy rushed into the room. "What's wrong, Mom?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Then she saw the phone in Alice's hand and guessed immediately. "Is it Peter?" she exclaimed. Alice nodded, unable to speak. Tammy wrapped her arms tightly around her mother's neck, shouting into the phone, "I missed you, Peter. You're finally calling us." Peter chuckled softly on the other end. "I missed you too, Tammy. Both of you." Tammy grabbed the phone from Alice's hand, her excitement bubbling over. "Peter, you have no idea how boring it's been here without you. Mom's been all serious and there's no one to prank anymore. You've got to come back soon." Peter laughed, his voice rich and full of life. "I'll be home as soon as I can, Tammy. I promise." Tammy grinned, talking a mile a minute about school, her friends, and even how much she hated math homework. She kept up the conversation until she noticed her mom's tears had finally stopped. With a yawn, she handed the phone back to Alice. "I have school in the morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Don't keep Peter on the phone all night, Mom." Alice kissed Tammy's forehead. "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Peter," Tammy called out as she headed upstairs. "Good night, Tammy," Peter said warmly. Once Tammy was gone, Alice took a deep breath, composing herself. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to cry like that." Peter's tone was gentle. "Don't apologize. It means a lot to me to know I've been missed." Alice smiled through the lingering tears. "You have. How's therapy going?" "It's intense," Peter admitted, "but I'm making great progress. The doctors say I'm on track to come home in 3 months." Alice's heart swelled with relief and joy. "That's amazing, Peter. I'm so proud of you." Peter hesitated before continuing. "Alice, I need to tell you something. You and Tammy keep me going. On the hardest days, I think about coming back to you both, and it keeps me pushing forward." Alice felt her tears threaten again, but held them back. "We're with you every step of the way, Peter." Alice paused, a thought crossing her mind. "Peter, could Tammy and I visit you? I'd love to see how you're doing, and Tammy misses you so much." There was a long pause before Peter replied. "Not yet, Alice. I can't say goodbye again. Not right now. But when I'm home, I want to pick up where we left off." Alice nodded, understanding his hesitation. "All right, but don't think you're getting out of our first dance." Peter laughed softly. "I wouldn't dream of it." They talked through the night, sharing stories, dreams, and plans for the future. By the time daylight broke through the windows, Alice felt more connected to Peter than ever. As they said their goodbyes, her heart was full of hope. The wait wouldn't be easy, but she knew it would be worth it. Peter called Alice every weekend without fail, updating her on his recovery and asking about her and Tammy. Over time, the calls became more than just a check-in. They were a lifeline for both of them. Peter shared stories about the progress he was making in therapy, and Alice filled him in on life at the Hall's estate, Tammy's school adventures, and her own thoughts about the future. What Alice didn't know was that when she wasn't around, Peter and Tammy were hatching a plan. During their private calls, Tammy's voice brimmed with excitement as she and Peter worked out every detail of a surprise for Alice. "Okay," Tammy whispered one night, "so when you come home, you're going to need to make it big, like epic." Peter chuckled. "Epic, huh? What do you have in mind?" Tammy outlined her ideas with enthusiasm. "First dance, just like Mom keeps joking about, but we're not going to wait until some wedding. We're doing it as soon as you're back." "I like it," Peter said, his voice warm, "but we'll need your grandmother's help to pull it off." "Oh, she'll love it," Tammy assured him. "She's been all about your recovery. She'll do anything for you." Peter laughed. "All right, let's get her on board." True to Tammy's prediction, Mrs. Halls was thrilled to be part of the plan. Over the next few weeks, she coordinated with Tammy and Peter to prepare the perfect setup for Alice's surprise. Peter also made it a point to downplay his progress to Alice during their calls, telling her that his recovery would take longer than expected. It was a necessary fib, one that would make his return even more meaningful. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Halls approached Alice with a request. "Alice, dear, I'm hosting a tea party in the garden tomorrow. Could you help me with some last-minute arrangements?" Alice, always happy to lend a hand, smiled. "Of course, Mrs. Halls. What time should I come over?" "Late afternoon," Mrs. Halls said with a twinkle in her eye. "Everything should be ready by then." The next day, Alice arrived at the Halls estate, expecting to help with simple decorations and table settings. As she walked through the house and into the garden, she stopped in her tracks. The space was unrecognizable. The garden had been transformed into a magical wonderland. Twinkling fairy lights hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the lush greenery. The air was filled with the gentle hum of soft music. In the center of it all, a small wooden dance floor had been set up, surrounded by an array of that Alice didn't remember planting. She turned to Mrs. Halls, her brows furrowed in confusion. "This is incredible. Are you sure this is for a tea party?" Before Mrs. Halls could respond, a familiar melody began to play. "Oh, Happy Me." Alice froze, her mouth falling open. "No," she muttered, her eyes narrowing. "This can't be." Suddenly, from behind a row of neatly trimmed bushes, Peter stepped out. He was standing. Alice's hand flew to her mouth as she gasped, tears instantly welling in her eyes. Peter, with the help of a cane, took a few steps forward, his face lighting up with the kind of grin she hadn't seen in months. "Surprise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Peter," Alice cried, rushing toward him. She stopped just short of throwing her arms around him, afraid of hurting him. "You're walking." "I told you I'd make it back," Peter said, his grin widening. "And I told you I'd be ready for that first dance." Alice laughed through her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're impossible." "And you're beautiful," Peter said, extending his hand. "May I have this dance?" Forgetting everything else, Alice placed her hand in his. The music swelled, and Peter led her onto the small dance floor. His movements were slow and deliberate, but his determination was clear. Alice followed his lead, her heart bursting with pride and love. From the edge of the garden, Tammy watched with a satisfied grin. "Told you it would be epic," she muttered to herself. Mrs. Halls, standing beside her granddaughter, wiped a tear from her eye. "Your mother is going to kill me for not telling her about this." Tammy laughed. "It'll be worth it." As the song came to an end, Peter pulled Alice closer, his eyes locking with hers. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For believing in me, for being my reason to keep going." Alice smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You've always had it in you, Peter. I just gave you a little push." They stayed like that for a moment, the world around them fading away. For Alice, this wasn't just a dance. It was the beginning of something new, something extraordinary. And for Peter, it was proof that he could overcome anything with by his side. As the music faded into the background, Peter tightened his grip on Alice's hand. His eyes twinkled with mischief, but there was a depth of emotion there that made her heart skip a beat. "I didn't forget," Peter said, his voice low and steady. Alice blinked, confused. "Forget what?" He smiled, tilting his head slightly. "I remember you saying that when you walk down your wedding aisle, you expect your husband to be standing at the end." Alice's cheeks flushed, the memory rushing back to her. "Peter," she began, shaking her head, "you really took on that challenge?" Peter shrugged, though his grin widened. "What can I say? You stirred something inside me that day. I think it was our first shouting match. You know, when you yelled at me for being a stubborn idiot." Alice burst out laughing, covering her mouth with her hand. "I yelled at you because you were being a stubborn idiot." "True," Peter admitted, laughing with her. "But I liked that you didn't back down. You challenged me, Alice, and I hadn't felt that alive in a long time. I knew then that you were different." Alice blushed deeper, her smile softening. "I can't believe you remember that, and to think I thought you were just being difficult on purpose." "Oh, I was," Peter said cheekily. "But it worked, didn't it?" Alice rolled her eyes, but the warmth in her gaze gave her away. "You're impossible, Peter." "And yet, here you are," he said, his voice growing softer, "dancing with me, laughing with me. You gave me something to fight for, Alice, and I'll keep fighting for you, for us, for the rest of my life." The months that followed were filled with moments of joy and discovery. Peter's recovery continued, and with Alice and Tammy by his side, he grew stronger every day. Their bond deepened, built on laughter, love, and the shared journey of healing. After a year of dating, Peter decided it was time to take the next step. He coordinated with Tammy and Mrs. Halls to plan the perfect proposal, wanting to surprise Alice just as he had on the day of their first dance. On a crisp autumn evening, Peter and Alice took a walk through the garden, now one of their favorite places. The leaves crunched beneath their feet as they strolled, the golden hues of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the estate. "Do you remember the first time we danced here?" Peter asked, stopping near the wooden bench where they had so often shared quiet moments. Alice smiled, leaning against him. "How could I forget? It feels like a lifetime ago." "Well, I thought it was time for a second dance," Peter said, pulling her gently onto the small dance floor that Mrs. Halls had kept intact for special occasions. This time, instead of "Oh Happy Me," a soft romantic melody played, filling the air. As they swayed together, Peter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Alice froze as he dropped to one knee, no cane, no wheelchair, just Peter standing tall before her. "Alice," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You gave me love, laughter, and a family I didn't know I needed. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Alice's face as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, Peter, of course I'll marry you." Tammy burst out from behind the bushes with a cheer, holding up a sign she'd made that said, "Finally!" Mrs. Halls followed close behind, clapping with tears in her eyes. The garden erupted in celebration, and Alice and Peter shared their second dance, this time as an engaged couple. A year later, on a sunny spring afternoon, Alice stood at the entrance of the church, her heart pounding as she prepared to walk down the aisle. Tammy stood beside her as her maid of honor, beaming with pride. "You ready, Mom?" Tammy asked, squeezing her hand. Alice nodded, taking a deep breath. The music began, and the doors opened. As Alice stepped forward, her eyes locked on Peter, who stood at the end of the aisle. He was standing tall and strong, his smile radiant as he watched her approach. When she reached him, Peter leaned in and whispered, "I told you I'd be standing here." Alice laughed softly, her eyes shining with love. "You never back down from a challenge, do you?" "Not when it comes to you," Peter replied, taking her hand. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, a testament to their journey together. Surrounded by family and friends, they exchanged vows that spoke of resilience, hope, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the room erupted in applause. Tammy whooped loudly from her spot beside them, and Mrs. Halls dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her pride evident. That evening, during the reception, Peter led Alice onto the dance floor once more, The same melody that had played during his proposal filled the air, and they moved together as though they had been dancing all their lives. "I love you, Peter," Alice said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "I love you too," Peter replied. "Forever and always." Their journey had been anything but conventional, but as they danced together, surrounded by the people who had supported them along the way, it was clear that their love was stronger than ever, proof that even the most unexpected paths can lead to the happiest of endings. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel.